Hello, welcome to Sabbath School with Branch Davidians. I'm Ed, and I'm here with my wife, Mary.
Hello, we're excited you're joining us today.
Yes, thanks for listening. We present or expound on a principle or belief related to the SDA Sabbath School Quarterly each week. This quarter is entitled God's Mission, My Mission. This week's lesson is called Mission to the Unreached, Part 2. In Wednesday's lesson in the Sabbath School Quarterly, we're told to read Galatians 2:11 through 13. We actually read up to verse 14, and then we'll bring some clarity to an issue that people often find confusing in this passage. Quote, "But when Peter came to Antioch, I, Paul, resisted him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before some people came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they didn't walk uprightly according to the truth of the good news, I said to Peter before them all, If you, being a Jew, live as the Gentiles do, and not as the Jews do, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as the Jews do?" Close quote, Galatians 2:11 through 14.
So clearly, there's some tension here between Paul and Peter and Barnabas. But what exactly is going on? The way some people see it, there are two sides, the circumcision faction on one side and Paul on the other. In this view, James, Peter, and Barnabas, and however many other Jewish followers of Jesus were part of the circumcision faction, while Paul was on the other side of the issue. What we'll be addressing in this study is whether this was really the case. We'll start with Peter, and then we'll move to James. But first, who were those of the circumcision?
Well, those of the circumcision refers to those who were part of the Jesus movement and who believed that circumcision was a requirement for being justified, for being saved from sin. To them, circumcision of the flesh was an overall symbol of works, of keeping the law. Acts 15 refers to them as Pharisees which believed. Here's something interesting A.T. Jones had to say about this group in connection with Galatians. Quote, "Now, with those Pharisees which believed, circumcision was the badge, the seal, the very pinnacle of works, of self-righteousness, and of salvation by works of self-righteousness. And these works included the law, all law, moral and ceremonial, which the Lord had given, and the ceremonies which the Pharisees had heaped upon all that the Lord had given, so that the scheme meant justification, salvation by law and works of law, by ceremonialism, not by Christ and the faith of Christ. Therefore, exactly as he, Paul, wrote of circumcision, Galatians 5:2, quote, Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Close quote. So now he writes of law, Galatians 5:4, quote, Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by law, you are fallen from grace. Close quote. That's A.T. Jones, Studies in Galatians, page 270.
So you can see why Paul was so against the views of the circumcision faction. Their views struck against the core of the gospel, which is justification by faith. Please see our studies on the topic of being saved from sinning by means of works versus being saved from sinning by means of faith, linked in the description for more on this. But the question at hand right now is, from reading Galatians 2:1 through 10, could we infer that Peter is of the circumcision faction? While Galatians clearly states that Peter acted contrary to the gospel on this occasion, does this mean that he advocated doctrines that were contrary to the gospel?
Notice that Galatians tells us that Peter feared those of the Jesus movement that were of the circumcision, not that he himself shared their views. If Peter was actually of the circumcision faction, why would he be in fear? Saying that a person acted out of fear of a certain group is very different from saying a person is part of a group. If Peter was actually part of the circumcision faction, he would have nothing to fear from them, since he would agree with them and would presumably be one of their leaders, given that he was one of the main leaders of the Jesus movement as a whole. This is sufficient to show that Peter actually wasn't part of the circumcision faction. Paul's rebuke to Peter was that Peter was hypocritical when he acted contrary to what he himself knew to be the principles of the gospel simply because he was afraid of controversy from the circumcision faction.
Now, we'll get into whether or not James was part of the circumcision faction in a minute. But first, let's consider the bigger picture of how people like James, Peter, and Paul fit into the overall Jesus movement. We know that Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, and James, Jesus' brother, were two of the main leaders of the Jesus movement. In fact, from both Galatians and Acts, we can say that they were the most prominent leaders. Obviously, what Peter and James were teaching was a reflection on what Jesus taught them. And if Paul's message was not in harmony with that of Peter and James, we would have to question it being in harmony with the teachings of Jesus.
According to Paul, he received the gospel message he preached directly from Jesus, and not any man. He tells us this in Galatians chapter 1. Excerpts starting in verse 1 read, quote, Paul, an apostle, not from men, nor through man, but through Jesus Christ, and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. But I make known to you, brothers, concerning the good news which was preached by me, that it is not according to man. For I didn't receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came to me through revelation of Jesus Christ. When it was the good pleasure of God to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I didn't immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia. Then I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Peter and stayed with him 15 days. But of the other apostles I saw no one except James, the Lord's brother. Now about the things which I write to you, behold, before God, I am not lying. Close quote, Galatians 1, verses 1, 11, 12, 15 through 20.
Now, it's very interesting that Paul has to say he's not lying here. Obviously, there were stories floating around that he received his gospel message from men and not God. But upon evidence of the timeline of his travels since his calling, he shows that he didn't even meet Peter and James until 3 years after his calling, so he couldn't have gotten his gospel message from them. Basically, what we can learn from all this is that the gospel Paul taught he received directly from Jesus, and this is important when it comes to the debates involving the circumcision faction dealt with in the rest of the letter, since the views of the circumcision faction were directly contrary to the gospel Paul was teaching.
We can also see from verses 18 and 19 of chapter 1 that on his first visit to Jerusalem, 3 years after he had received the gospel directly from Jesus, the only apostles he met with were Peter and Jesus' brother James. Then, in chapter 2 of Galatians, Paul tells us that 14 years after that, he went to Jerusalem again. This time he went to verify that the gospel he was preaching was the same as that of the pillars of the Jesus movement, and he took others along with him. You see, Paul was considered a second-tier leader in the Jesus movement as compared with the pillars of the faith, Peter, James, and John.
Even though Paul needed the Galatians to understand that he received his message straight from Jesus and not the other apostles, he also knew that his message could not be legitimate if it was not in harmony with the message of the apostles who preceded him and who were acknowledged as apostles by all who profess to follow Christ. He went to Jerusalem this second time to see the acknowledged leaders and presented before them the gospel he taught in order to make sure he was not running in vain. He had with him Barnabas and also Titus, a fellow believer who was an uncircumcised Greek. And not only did the acknowledged leaders not compel Titus to be circumcised, they gave them the right hand of fellowship and acknowledged that God had given Paul the mission of teaching the gospel to the uncircumcised.
So, according to Paul, James was on the same page as he was. We see here that Paul, Peter, James, and John were all on the same page. Now, after establishing all that, let's again read Galatians 2, 11 through 12. It reads, quote, But when Peter came to Antioch, I, Paul, resisted him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before some people came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. Close quote, Galatians 2, 11 through 12.
So when we read this passage, it's normal to assume a scenario behind this. A lot of people take the phrase that says, Some people came from James and assumed that these people must represent James's views, and therefore he and Paul must not have been in harmony. But that's just an assumption. And as we'll see, it's an unwarranted assumption, since one could just as easily assume different scenarios based off the language of these verses. So we're going to go through several other scenarios that someone might assume. Not that we're saying any of these are the scenario of what actually happened, but as we already said, they all could equally be assumed based off this language in Galatians 2:11 through 12.
Let's start with this as a possible alternative scenario. James sent these people knowing they were of the circumcision faction, but not as representatives of his view on circumcision, rather to do something totally unrelated to circumcision, such as deliver a letter or something else. While there, they advocated their agenda, perhaps against James's wishes.
Here's another possible scenario we could assume. James sent them knowing they were of the circumcision faction, but not as representatives of his view, and not because he agreed with them. Instead, he believed they could be swayed to abandon their view of circumcision, and since he was too busy with the administrative affairs of the church, he thought it best to send them to Peter and Paul in Antioch so that they, the circumcision, could be taught by them, Peter and Paul, of the true gospel. Unfortunately, the plan backfired, and they had a greater influence on Peter than he had on them.
Another assumption we can make is this. James sent them not knowing they were of the circumcision faction and not agreeing with their unknown views on circumcision. He could have sent them to do something totally unrelated to the circumcision question, and they only manifested that they were of the circumcision faction after arriving in Antioch and used the fact that they were sent by James in order to put some authority behind their beliefs.
Another scenario could be James knew they were of the circumcision faction, but didn't agree with them and didn't send them. They had gone to James to try to convince him of their views, but failed, and thus went from him to pursue Peter in Antioch to make an attempt to persuade him.
And how about this one? James didn't know they were of the circumcision party, and he did not send them. They came to him and learned from him in Jerusalem, giving the impression that they were honest learners. Later, they went from him in Jerusalem to Antioch on their own accord, perhaps without James even knowing. There in Antioch, they used the actual teaching of James to convince people they were true brothers and sisters, but they interwove their own view of circumcision into their teachings and thus were able to bring about confusion.
The point we're making by giving all these possible scenarios is that the wording of Galatians 2:12 is ambiguous enough to allow for all of them. Saying that certain people who were of the circumcision faction came from James to Antioch and triggered Peter's hypocrisy could indeed be understood as indicating that James was of the circumcision faction and sent these people to spread that perspective on the means of salvation. But it could just as easily be interpreted in all the above ways, and probably more. If a piece of data could be just as easily used as evidence to support multiple contradictory conclusions, it can't be used as evidence in favor of any of those conclusions.
But we actually have reason to know James wasn't of the circumcision faction. If in Galatians 2:1 through 10, Paul tells us that the acknowledged leaders of the Jesus movement, Peter, James, and John, endorsed his message and did not endorse the message of the circumcision faction, then it would make no sense for Paul to immediately thereafter imply that James was in fact part of the circumcision faction. That would destroy his whole argument in Galatians 2:1 through 10. Thus, any interpretation of the wording of Galatians 2:10, which understands it to be indicating that James was in disagreement with Paul, cannot be a sound interpretation. Not only is it only one interpretation among many, but it rests on baseless assumptions and is directly contradicted by the preceding context.
So from this study, we wanted to highlight two things. One is that Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, taught that he and the other apostles were all in unity in their understanding and teaching of the gospel message, justification by faith rather than by works, and that this message was received by all of them directly from Jesus. The other thing we can learn from this study is the importance of not inferring an interpretation of a text or an interpretation of anything if there are other scenarios that could also be equally inferred from the same text. If we love truth, we must be sure not to make unwarranted inferences and be willing to accept both what we can know and what we can't know from the things that are revealed to us in the Word of God. Not that inferences are never warranted, but again, if data can lead to more than one conclusion, it cannot be used as evidence for any of them. And we need to carry this principle out in our thoughts about common things as well. For example, say we text a person and they don't text us right back. Would we be justified in inferring that they're angry at us? No, because that data that someone didn't text us back could be used as evidence for multiple conflicting conclusions, which invalidates it as evidence for any of them. Like, maybe their phone died and they lost their charger. That's one conclusion we could equally infer from the data, again that they didn't text us back. Maybe they were busy when they saw the text notification and later forgot about the text. You get the point. There are many reasons someone might not text us back, and to infer one conclusion over another is simply not justifiable. We would need to get more data that is exclusive to one conclusion over all others in order to know the truth. And that's what we did here with the statement from Paul that people came from James that were from the circumcision faction that influenced Peter to do something hypocritical. When we got more data, conveniently from the preceding verses in Galatians, we then had enough evidence to justifiably conclude that James was not part of the circumcision faction. In fact, we have good reason to conclude that he, Peter, Paul, and all the apostles were united on the gospel of justification by faith, which precluded the necessity of circumcision.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. We invite you to visit our website, www.bdsda.com, to learn more about who we are and, just as important, who we are not. Please join us each week as we will continue to offer new and interesting insights for your Sabbath School studies.
And if you want to keep up with our new studies as they're published, we recommend subscribing. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on plenty of other podcast apps. Links for subscribing are in the description.
God bless.
Many blessings.